Just as we start this broadcast of what is happening in Afghanistan, we'd like to take a moment to inform our viewers that we at WION have taken a conscious call to not show some of the images that have emerged from the site of the blast at the Kabul International Airport. Now, there are a lot of images that are doing the rounds on social media, and it is at this point of time important to give dignity to those who have died in the blast, which is the reason why we've chosen to not show them on our screens. Remember, at least about 90 Afghan civilians and about 13 American troops have been killed in a deadly suicide bombing that took place outside the Kabul International Airport, the airport that is now under the control of the Americans. Reports say that at least about 28 people who died in the deadly bombings were in fact Taliban members. The so-called Islamic State Khorasan has taken responsibility for the attack. There are some very disturbing visuals of dead bodies being piled up, of injured being taken to hospitals that have been doing the rounds on social media. Now, the blast comes just days ahead of the 31st of August deadline when the Americans are supposed to conclude their evacuation completely. The attack also marks a deadly escalation in a crisis that has been unfolding at the Kabul airport since the Taliban has taken control. And remember, the airport is under the control of the Americans. Media reports say that the bombers were able to penetrate all the security barriers and security fortifications. And at least 2 suicide vest bombs were detonated. The attack has now fueled urgency for the foreign troops to airlift as many people out of Afghanistan as they can. The people who are waiting to be evacuated outside of the airport are in a state of complete shock. A graphic video that's been shared on social media platforms shows dead bodies that are lying in a canal adjacent to the airport. Wounded people in blood-soaked clothing were ferried away in wheelbarrows. Survivors desperately shouted for help as they tried to look for their loved ones. Now remember, just yesterday, many Afghans were seen standing knee-deep in sewage water waiting for their turn to enter into the airport. After a few hours of the attack, crowds began to gather as the deadline to complete the evacuation is now closing in. Locals have told the reporters on the ground that the first explosion, in fact, resulted in complete panic. And now, according to reports that have come in, the Taliban also reportedly started firing in the air to try and disperse the crowd after the explosion. Now, WION's correspondent Anas Malik has been relentlessly tracking and reporting from the Hamid Karzai International Airport and has sent us more information on the series of events that unfolded yesterday evening. In total, it was not just 2 suicide bombings that took place, but a total of 7 explosions that were recorded in Kabul yesterday. 2 of them took place from near the Kabul International Airport, where the troops were deployed. The Americans have said that both the blasts were in fact suicide bombings that were carried out by the so-called Islamic State. However, the ISIS has said that one suicide bomber had in fact targeted the Abbey Gate, which is under the control solely of the American soldiers. Now, other explosions are presumed to have been carried out by the American forces, reportedly controlled explosions that were aimed at blowing up equipment. Because remember, in one provincial capital after another, wherever the Americans have evacuated, their equipment, their weapons, etc. has now fallen into the hands of the Taliban. In recent years, the so-called Islamic State has launched a number of terror attacks in Afghanistan. The so-called Islamic State has massacred civilians who've been praying at mosques, praying at shrines. They've targeted school kids in schools and even hospitals. The so-called Islamic State's Khorasan chapter and the Taliban are both hardline Sunni terrorists. The group has especially targeted Muslims from other sects, including from the Shia sect. All right, now to give us more insights in terms of what's exactly happening in Kabul at this point of time, we are joined in from London by Lynn O'Donnell. Lynn is, of course, an author and also a journalist who's been tracking Afghanistan very closely. Lynn, thank you very much indeed for joining us in this broadcast. You know, what has been unfolding at the Kabul International Airport is something that was being talked about by the intelligence agencies and also by the American president himself, where he warned that there was a possibility of a terror attack at the Kabul International Airport. But despite that, very little seems to be done in preventing it.
I don't know about that, to be honest with you. I think warnings were issued 24 hours in advance. It's whether or not you believe the warnings, because there's always a lot of warnings about terrorist attacks, but a lot of them don't come. I think that there were a lot of warnings, and there were pleas to people to not go to the airport yesterday. The problem is that people don't get that message. As you know, for the past 10 days since the 16th of August, the airport has been rammed with tens of thousands of people who want to get out. Whether or not they got the message not to go to the airport yesterday, especially not to go to the Abbey Gate, is open to question. Would they have gone whether they got the message or not? We don't know. But to be honest with you, over the past 20 years, large gatherings of people have attracted these sort of attacks. The Haqqani network, which is the brutal branch of the Taliban, which has been very much in control of the most brutal attacks over the last 20 years, is in charge of Kabul security. I'm not sure. I believe it was ISK. I think that it's very easy to name names. The Haqqani are in charge of security in Kabul. I wouldn't be surprised if it was the Haqqani themselves.
But Haqqanis are very closely, in many ways, allied to the Taliban. Do you think this is something that the Haqqanis would do at a time when the Taliban are quite clearly in control of the country?
Well, are they in control of the country? They have a lot of the space, but there's still fighting going on. At the moment, we have a view of Afghanistan solely through the prism of Kabul. And the reason for that is that there's no journalists, no Afghan journalists functioning outside of Kabul anymore. Over the past few months, they've been intimidated. Their media organisations have been closed down. Many of them have moved to Kabul to be in safe houses. So all we're getting from outside the capital is anecdotal reports of retribution, revenge attacks, mass murders in places like Mazar-e Sharif, the Taliban going door to door. This is a brutal reign of terror that we're seeing if we look close enough. Now, what happened in Kabul yesterday? Yeah, I wouldn't put it past the Taliban or the Haqqani to be the perpetrators, simply because it's against the Americans. They want the Americans out. And hey, presto, the Brits have announced that they're pulling out in a matter of hours. They're not even going to stick around until the 31st of August. Anyone who wasn't able to get through that mess, that catastrophic mess at the airport gate, is out of luck with the Brits. They're out. It's just been an appalling and appallingly managed evacuation. The French were doing it for, 4 or 5 months. They did it much better. They got all their people out. I don't know why the Americans and the Brits weren't able to do it in the same way. And this is the result.
Absolutely, indeed. Now, there's a lot of back and forth that is going on even domestically within the United States in terms of how the Americans have handled this evacuation. Now, President Biden says that he is executing the evacuation at this point of time, but the person who actually struck the deal with the Taliban was Donald Trump. How badly do you think at this point of time this botched up evacuation from Afghanistan is going to affect Joe Biden's presidency?
I think in the long term it won't affect it at all. American people will look at the result. They didn't want their military in Afghanistan any longer. Donald Trump did the wrong thing. I think that's fairly clear, and we've known that for more than a year. The February 29, 2020 deal was basically it handed the Taliban a massive criminal enterprise that deals in drugs and illicit minerals, political legitimacy. So what we're seeing now is the rise of the world's biggest criminal cartel to power in a very strategically located country. I mean, in India, you know that as well as anybody does. So with the backing of China, Russia, Pakistan and Iran, the only 4 embassies that are currently open and functioning in Kabul, I think what we're seeing is a creation of another North Korean-style dark space.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed, Lynn O'Donnell, for joining us and getting us all those insights there. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.